Hi, Gary Zacharias with the Apologist bookshelf. You ever read the Bible and said, this sounds weird? We got talking snakes, we've got certain clothing to wear, all sorts of strange rules and all. Is the Bible anti-woman? Seems like it's maybe anti-science, it's pro-violence, it's pro-slavery. Trying to make sense out of all of that for some people is a big struggle. And thank goodness a man named Dan Kimball wrote a book, How Not to Read the Bible, and it's making sense of verses that people have pulled out of context and said, see, the Bible's against women. See, it's against science or whatever. So I've done two podcasts in the past on this book. I want to do chapter 6 now. It's titled Making Sense of Shrimp, the Skin of a Dead Pig, and Slavery. So he starts off, Kimball does, by saying, he's been trying to take these odd Bible verses to show the backstories that would help people understand today what it meant to the people at the time they were given. God didn't want them to do certain things, certain prohibitions that would have compromised their faith in God. But for this chapter, Kimball says, what about something that's not a prohibition, it's more of an endorsement, like slavery, for example? Why would God allow some things but not others back in Old Testament times? What should we be doing today? And then he says, well, a lot of people will respond, well, many of the laws were specific for Israel and they made sense back then. But Kimball says, well, then why don't we still follow them today? How do we know which verses are valid for today and which verses aren't? And he says that takes us back to the Bible storyline. So the Bible was first given to the ancient Israelites around 1300 BC, time of Moses. And of course, in that section, God was instructing them how to follow him and stay holy when they were around other people that worshipped all these different gods. And then we come to today, the church age, and something happened in between there. Jesus came and everything changed. And from the time of Jesus onward, we have to look at everything in the Bible through a new way of interpretation, a new lens, he says. So in the Old Testament, God relates to his people one way, and in the New Testament, Jesus talks about a new covenant with God through Jesus, a new way to relate to God. So the New Testament writings tell us that all those odd verses and all those Old Testament laws were given in the Old Testament to convict people that you can't follow. All that God requires us to worship him and live in perfect harmony with him. It's our inability, our imperfections. It's the fallout of sin. And all those laws point out we need a Savior. We all fail trying to please God on our own. And the more you look at his guidelines, take the 10 Commandments. Who in the world is living as they should with those 10 Commandments? And then what about also just our own rules that we think would be correct and moral, and we can't live up to those. So we can't be perfect. We can't set ourselves apart from the value of the world. We need a way of being clean before God and forgiven for our shortcomings. And it says the Old Testament, all those things written in the Bible at the beginning there, point to our real need, our dependency on Jesus. And Kimball has us reference Romans 7, verses 7 to 9, and Galatians 3:24. So I'm going to not read those and keep going here. But when Jesus came and he died on the cross and he rose again, that's a new way to relate to God at that point. And so we see differences when we get to the New Testament. There are new guidelines. There's that new covenant again. And it's not limited this time to a particular people group, is it? Everybody can come to Christ. In fact, I often tell apologetics classes that I deal with, if you talk about multi-ethnic qualities, people always praise multi-ethnic virtues these days. It's so important to be inclusive. Well, there's nothing more inclusive than the body of believers these days. Does that make sense? We're the largest multi-ethnic group on earth. It's Christians. So we have this new covenant, not limited to a particular people group. Now, of course, the Old Testament is still important. We can read it and find out what God is like and what he did in the past, as well as origins of the human race and how Jesus came and why Jesus came. We need to study. We need to know the Old Testament. But Kimball says we've got to know also why we apply or we don't apply certain worship practices or dietary or civil laws today. We're in a post-Jesus time period in the storyline. And the way God has related to people before Jesus, that's different than the way God relates to us after Jesus. There's no need, for example, to sacrifice animals. Isn't that good? There's no need for a temple. God's Spirit dwells in us if we put our faith in Jesus. So we're the temple. There's no longer a need to be bound to the law. Jesus started a new covenant with God, and so we follow the new covenant. So he says, all those crazy things they've been looking at in the previous chapters of the book here fall under Old Testament law. Now, they were needed. It helped the people of God know who God was and how to live with each other. And some of those laws were to show the Israelites how to worship God, a sacrificial system, and some of them were intended to keep the Israelites distinct from other people groups. But here's the key thing. None of these Old Testament laws are still binding on Christians today. We're in a different time period. When Jesus came, Kimball says there was like a reboot, a fulfillment and expansion of the Old Testament that led to a new way. He says if you want to dig deeper, you could read about this shift in Galatians 3:23 and 24, Galatians 6:2, and 1 Corinthians 9:21. So I'm going to continue. So what is the law of Jesus? How is that different than the Old Testament law? Well, Jesus said the greatest commands that you can pull out of the Old Testament were two. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. If we obey just those two commandments, we're fulfilling what God required. That's the goal. That's the ultimate reason why he gave laws to those people in the first place. In Matthew, Jesus said all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. So, let's take a look at the New Testament. God talks a lot about love there, right? The writers talk about loving God. Well, how does he define love? So that's one of the reasons God gave us the New Testament. The entire New Testament really focuses, we begin to see the love God requires of us and what our lives should look like if we really want to love God and what it looks like to love other people. So he gets to a new section here that says the New Testament is a fresh start with God, but we don't dismiss the old. So when Jesus came, he taught that he was here to fulfill the requirements and the purpose of the law. Now, a lot of people are going to say, well, that sounds like he's erasing all the Old Testament laws. No, there are some things God established in the Old Testament that continues with Jesus in the New Testament, but there are some things that came to an end. Well, how do we know? Kimball says the simplest way to know what continues and what doesn't, are you surprised? Read the New Testament to see what was explicitly carried on from the Old Testament and what wasn't. So, for example, look up eating shrimp and pork, he says. That's not in the New Testament. It was in the Old Testament. Jesus declared all foods are now clean. The Apostle Paul in 1 Timothy says, everything God created is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it's received with thanksgiving because it's consecrated by the word of God and prayer. So food is good. Paul says the mark of being set apart is a heart grateful to God, not dietary restrictions. Well, what about some other Old Testament ideas about clothing and wearing two types of fabrics? But he says if you look at the New Testament writings, do you see anything in there that talks about fabric for our clothing? No. Clothing is no longer a mark of a special role or a relationship with God like the priests of the Old Testament. So what does the New Testament say at all? Does it have anything to say about wear? Yeah. It says be modest in what we wear. It doesn't specify kinds of materials because we're not dealing with ancient Israel. We don't have to worry about cooking a goat in its mother's milk. Those were laws, specific practices of competing faiths. And we don't have to worry about that anymore. The New Testament, he says, reveals which Old Testament guidelines continue. Not everything, he says, is dismissed from the laws of the Old Testament. It says, in fact, many of the moral laws, rather than the ceremonial laws, said many of the moral laws continue, and they're reinforced in the New Testament. Like what? Well, Kimball says the Old Testament says you should not murder. That doesn't come to an end in the New Testament. Many moral commands like these are repeated or they're affirmed in the New Testament. Jesus expands on a lot of the moral laws to clarify and strengthen their importance. So Jesus says hating or murdering somebody in your heart is like real physical murder in God's eyes. Jesus is concerned with our hearts, so he focuses on that. What I like that Kimball does at this point, he says, here's a helpful summary from Tim Keller. And I really like Tim Keller a lot. So he's taking some of Tim Keller here to try to explain this thing about what do you keep from the Old Testament or what do you toss? So here's what Keller says. The coming of Christ changed how we worship, but not how we live. The moral law outlines God's own character, his integrity, love, and faithfulness. And so everything the Old Testament says about loving our neighbor, caring for the poor, generosity with our possessions, social relationships, and commitment to our family, it's still in force. The New Testament continues to forbid killing or committing adultery, and all the sex ethic of the Old Testament is restated. And he gives you a few verses here, Matthew 5, 27 to 30, 1 Corinthians 6, 9 to 20, 1 Timothy 1, 8 through 11. So Keller ends by saying, if the New Testament has reaffirmed a commandment, then it's still in force for us today. So, back to Kimball, he said, so a lot of the Old Testament laws are no longer valid, but some do remain valid, especially when they regard moral behavior, how we treat others. You know, what God says about murder, sexual ethics. When he spoke about murder, for example, Jesus didn't say, I'm throwing out the old. He says, look at the law. What was God's intent? Murder begins with hatred in your heart. And when Jesus is asked about divorce, he doesn't adopt the contemporary Roman and Greek ethics. He says, look back. What's God's intention regarding marriage? Well, he goes back to Genesis chapter 1 and 2. When he's asked about dietary laws, though, or how to obey the Sabbath, Jesus gives new teaching. He says the purpose of the Sabbath goes beyond the ritual observance. He says you don't need to worry about dietary restrictions. All foods are now declared clean. So to basically to know which laws still apply, which ones don't, look at what Jesus said. Look what the writers of the New Testament say, what they say would continue, and understand why they said it. And then we can decide which laws don't need to be continued. In general, he says, as sort of a wrap-up, in general, laws that regard the ordering of the Israelite nation, in other words, civil laws, those laws regarding temple sacrifice and worship, those ceremonial laws, and the dietary restrictions, what they call them holiness laws, they're no longer needed. Jesus has come. So I think that's really crucial and important. In the next section, he says, wear polyester blends, eat shrimp, enjoy ham, and play football. So he says, when you read or hear a reference telling Christians not to eat shrimp or pork or wear clothing made of two different fabrics, he says, you know why those rules are no longer valid. When people mock or seek to discredit the Bible by pointing those verses out, all they show is their lack of understanding. Exactly. He says it's easy to grab bizarre verses from the Old Testament and claim Christians are breaking the rules by not following them. But he says what it really shows is a lack of understanding. People don't know the story of the Bible. They don't know the difference between the original covenant God made and the new covenant. And he doesn't mention it here, but I wanted to end this podcast by, I bet you could find it. I've seen it on YouTube. There was a show a long time ago called West Wing. It was about a president of the United States played by Martin Sheen. So in one episode, he's got a room full of people and he comes in and he's talking to them. Well, one woman there is based loosely on a woman that used to give advice on the radio and was supposed to be, I guess, a Christian. And so Martin Sheen, as the president, points to her and says, oh, I'm glad you're here today. And he's very kind. And then he starts in, okay, tell me. And he goes through some of these laws, like the Washington football team is going to be playing football. Should they not touch the ball if it's made out of pig skin? And he goes and he tries to make fun of these Old Testament laws, just what Dan Kimball's talking about. And she has no answer for it. And she gets really embarrassed. And he's put her down. Well, ha-ha. Right? All you have to do, it's real easy to put down a Christian. You just throw Old Testament laws at them. But do you see what Kimball is saying? We need to be a little more, so we need to study our Bibles. We need to think about it. But there's a huge difference between the Old Testament laws and what Jesus came and did and replaced them with. So there's this. That's only half the chapter, but it's a pretty long section here, and I don't want to get into it because it's so important by itself. And I hate to tag it on here at the end. The next portion, I think maybe I'll just do the next podcast on the second half of this chapter. This one is on slavery. And as he points out, there are Bible verses in the Old Testament that seems to indicate God doesn't oppose slavery. Well, then even in the New Testament, it mentions slavery, but it doesn't seem to condemn it. There's never a verse in the Bible anywhere that says, end all slavery immediately. And Kimball points out this is a major and understandable criticism of the Bible. So he says you ought to take the question really seriously. So I'm going to stop at this point. Let's cover the slavery one in the next podcast, because I've heard that more than once myself. It's a major issue among non-Christians to put down Christianity. All right, well, thank you for being part of this podcast, and we'll do another one soon.